is as follows. We will start with Lexi.
Hi. Hi, I'm Lexi Bowes-Lyon. I'm the Director of Philanthropy for Space for Giants. We're an NGO based down in Kenya. We operate in 9 different countries in Africa. And our mission is to demonstrate ecological and economic value to the wildlife and protecting landscapes bring. We are protecting wildlife and the landscapes, and we're looking to show the connectivity between everything from deforestation, protecting areas, wildlife crime, and judicial support.
And the next one, Angela.
Thank you. I think Lexi and I got the gender gap covered on this. I am Angela Grimes. I'm with Born for USA. I'm the CEO of the organization for the United States. We are part of a larger organization that works around the world, and our primary focus is that humans and animals can live in harmony and free ourselves from that conflict and have the animals living with compassion, respect, and in their rightful habitat, which is, of course, the wild, not captivity. We have programs around the world. We're working in the United States primarily on legislative and other advocacy issues. And in Africa, we have an organization in Ethiopia where we have a wildlife sanctuary. We have 2 sanctuaries in South Africa for big cats. We work in Kenya as well, which is really the foundation of Born Free's history, having been the location of filming the film Born Free, where our founders had starred in that movie. And it is the home of Elsa, if you're familiar with that story. We're also working in the West and Central Africa on capacity building, wildlife law enforcement, and combating the international and illegal wildlife trade, specifically as relates to CITES, protected species.
Thank you. And Edwin, Tambara.
Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Edwin Tambara. I work with the African Wildlife Foundation. We are an African organization headquartered in Nairobi, but with a global reach. So I think that makes us unique. We work across Southern Africa, and our approach is to support African governments to ensure that conservation is part of Africa's aspirations and development agenda. I think we are all aware that Africa is going through massive change, and if we do not make sure that conservation is part and parcel of that change, conservation is seen as an avenue for development for Africa, we are going to lose most of our wildlife and our wildlands. So our role is to help African governments to balance the needs and the ambitions for development and also conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, when we come to the issue of our panel, the challenges facing African wildlife conservation, Lexi, what are your perspectives on that? How do you address that from the Space for Giants organization perspective?
Well, I think if we take one of the first issues, which is wildlife trafficking, and then there's 2 elements to look at. There's the poaching issue that happens, and then what happens after the poachers get caught. So I know we work with AWF, and specifically on our judicial reform program, which is really investing in the legal side of this. So firstly, when someone gets caught poaching, less than 24% in Kenya of poaching crimes were successfully prosecuted. And this wasn't necessarily because of corruption or because of issues there. It was literally just from the criminal trial process not being in place. So we invested in training prosecutors and monitoring courts and writing effective prosecution toolkits. And we've done this very successfully with AWF, specifically on appropriate sentencing and reporting of rapid reference guides. And this is just really, we've rolled this out across 6 African countries. And this is hugely important because there's a lot of focus on preventing wildlife crime. And there's a lot of organizations that are doing it very effectively. But where the issue really fails is at the judicial side of things. So for us to be able to effectively change this, and we've seen it from going from less than 24% to over now 83% of successful prosecutions in Kenya, has been a huge, huge success for us. So if I was to, there's another, there's some places like ports, for instance, that have multi-jurisdiction. And one of the things we've just recently rolled out is know your customer. So this is very similar to what you have in banks, where you know who your customer is, you know who the freight shipping is, and you do your due diligence. So when it comes to wildlife, doing your investigations into wildlife crime, these sort of processes are incredibly important to finding out who the perpetrator is. What else we have? When it comes to poachers, there's no point in we are intelligence-led, so there's no point in responding after the threat is there. We have to know what the threat is before it even happens. So having intelligence-led anti-poaching units that are reactionary before knowing where the issue comes from is highly important for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me move on to Edwin. Same question to you from the perspective of the African Wildlife Foundation.
Yeah, so what we see as the challenges for conservation in Africa, and I think illegal wildlife trade is one of the key challenges currently. And for us, we have deployed a similar approach, 3-pronged approach, looking at how do we stop the killing on the ground. And this has involved working a lot with local communities who really interface with the wildlife on the ground. For us, they form the first line of defense against any incursions into the area or any poachers coming into the area. So really working with communities to ensure that they are empowered, they get benefit from conservation for them to have a positive attitude towards wildlife. They feel the ownership. I think Ambassador talked about promoting communities to own conservancies. It thereby allows them to feel the ownership that they have a stake in conservation, and so they are able to participate in protecting wildlife. The second layer looks at stopping the trafficking, and she has really alluded very well, so I won't touch much on that. And then the third layer looks at stopping the demand, and this is where we have worked with a number of partners in Asia to try and educate the masses through various means, the media, working with celebrities, but also recently working with the Beijing Zoo and Shanghai Zoo. It's amazing the window of opportunity we have had there. The Beijing Zoo receives, I think in summer, upwards of 200,000 people who come through the gates to the zoo. So it's an opportunity we had to showcase African wildlife and spread the message as to the impacts of poaching on African wildlife. So that has really helped in raising the issues in Asia. But apart from illegal wildlife trade, which we think is a crisis to some extent that needed our attention, but long term we see the challenge for Africa in terms of conservation is habitat loss. And again, I go back to the point I made earlier. If we look at the rate at which Africa is changing, the rate at which our population is growing, agricultural expansion, infrastructure development, it means that we are making trade-offs, sometimes informed, but most of the times uninformed trade-offs, and we are losing habitat for wildlife. So the key challenge for us is how do we make sure that we balance the two? We ensure that Africa develops as it should, but at the same time not at the cost or at the loss of Africa's wildlife. And so that for us is a long-term challenge that we have to work with African leadership to look for solutions on how to solve that.
How to ensure sustainable development in Africa, but not having at the expense of wildlife development, conservation.
Maybe just to go on to that, I think what's really important is conservation and protecting these habitats has to become valuable to its governments and to the local communities, because if it's not, it's never going to work. So creating value through protected areas is one of our key objectives, and I think for all of us here is really, really important.
And as we were talking about that just earlier, along with that is not just addressing the conservation issues and what's happening with the animals, but addressing more of even taking a step back or a step deeper into what are the real issues. And I will tell a story about somebody in India around a tiger reserve goes into the forest in the middle of the night to relieve themselves. They're attacked by a tiger. The community kills the tiger in retaliation. The problem was not the tiger. The problem was a lack of sanitation facilities. So sometimes you really have, not sometimes, you always have to look at the 360 view of what do we need to do for the communities, what do we need to do for the people that simultaneously benefits the animals and establishes a long-term solution, not just a short-term one.
Thank you. And I know that at some point, Angela, you have a short video.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about in addition to certainly habitat fragmentation, lack of prosecution in the illegal wildlife trade and the trade in general, is trophy hunting and canned hunting. Canned hunting, which you have just seen kind of the lifespan of that industry play out in about 90 seconds, is something that is particularly an issue in South Africa. And this is It's something I think across the board, people agree that it is an unethical, immoral practice. Unfortunately, the laws are not following the public opinion on that right now, and it's work to be done. You have mothers who are breeding cubs taken away from them at just a couple of days old so that they can then be bred again very quickly. You have volunteers, paying volunteers, who are unwittingly thinking they're coming to take care of orphaned cubs that are going to be eventually released into the wild. They are simply bred animals that then go into, as they get older, the Walk with Lions programs, the photo ops, the selfies, until they're eventually sold into the canned hunting industry. So it's something that has very serious ethical concerns and moral concerns that we're working on, and hope to be able to get the South African government behind it and start to put some enforcement efforts behind.
Thank you. Challenges facing African wildlife conservation. What comments, what contributions, what questions do you have?
As you might know, in Bowes-Lyon we have a lot of human-wildlife conflict. And I'm disturbed when I continue to read about the way that elephants are destroying the livelihoods of small farmers. When you talk about enabling and empowering women, a lot of the farmers in that country are women whose crops are destroyed, whose relatives are killed. And so far, I haven't heard anybody address this particular issue. So while you're concerned about the conservation of the four-legged animals, you should also be concerned about the conservation of the two-legged animals. And so that is all that I would say for Tam. No, I'll say one more thing at this point. And that is, I think that your panels would be more legitimate if you have some of these women appear on the panel. For example, you remember that in King Leopold's Ghost, that the complaints that the British were making about what was happening in the Congo at the hands of King Leopold did not really come to light until the local people testified before the Blue River Committee that King Leopold had sent to the Congo to whitewash a study. But that did not happen after that testimony.
I just wanted to recognize the presence of a special guest that came from Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, Ablaye Diabaté, here present, and he represents from Côte d'Ivoire, and he's a resource person who will be very useful as well. Welcome. Yes.
I think in answer to your statement, your question, human-wildlife conflict is increasingly a more pressing issue than even poaching in Africa, across Africa. Africa's population by 2050 is only a third of the world's population. It's an ever-increasing population which relies on food production, water, security, and space. And space is the biggest thing that we need to conserve. Without the protection of these areas, there will be everything from loss of carbon sequestration for our world, food productivity, access to clean water, and the list goes on. So what you just brought up is actually, it's a vital issue. Botswana has a lot of elephants that have escaped other conflicts, and they historically have felt safe and have gone to Botswana. It does have too many elephants in it now, like a lot of the other countries in the world. And this was a key election issue, was human-elephant conflict. So what can we do about this? One of the main things we can do is to collar a lot of elephants just to see where their migratory routes are. This can inform policy through what are the areas that need protecting and how do we protect them from subsistence farmers. So fences are one of the many options, and it's just fencing, it's education, but it's also fencing out elephants and fencing in humans, but so that we have corridors where elephants migrate through. They're continuously moving, and if they can move safely, protected in corridors, they won't try and attack crops and farmers. But it's increasingly important, and we've been successful with a lot of about 105 kilometers worth of fencing across Kenya, Gabon, Botswana, and Uganda, and we've seen a very real difference made through this. So I'd say that one is a huge, advantage to this. I know that also within what's happening because of this is the hunting ban has been lifted. Going back to what you were talking about with hunting, it's an interesting topic, and if you put aside the ethical issues of hunting, there's something like, there's a huge amount of protected areas that are not effectively bringing in value across Africa. And one of the issues is that a lot of these protected areas are hunting blocks, which are bringing in the only money that they are bringing in to some of these areas. Now, if and hunting is becoming less and less popular, but if it goes, what are we putting in its space? So there needs to be a conversation, and it's very easy to say, let's get rid of hunting, let's stop this happening. But what is going to be the income in its place if nothing else is in that area? So obviously high-end tourism and tourism all around Africa is expanding, but for some of those places that tourism can't be present in, what could it be? Maybe carbon offsets. But I think this needs to be a conversation that the whole sector is having together, because the hunting debate is a very real one, but in country is very different to the West. So over here, everyone really cares, and it's a hugely important topic, especially in Botswana right now, of what's happening. But if going further in Africa, in Botswana specifically, these issues are really apparent. So thank you for your question.
Donc, merci. Je disais tantôt que l'une des causes majeures aussi de la disparition de la faune au niveau de l'Afrique, surtout subsaharienne, c'est aussi les conflits. Et avec les conflits, nous avons une forte migration des populations. Et à ce jour, les conflits changent de visage. D'abord, au niveau de l'Afrique subsaharienne, on a constaté que les conflits étaient d'abord des guerres civiles post-électorales. Et de plus en plus dans nos régions, nous voyons que ces guerres changent de visage parce qu'on vient maintenant avec des bandes armées et puis un peu les djihadistes qui s'installent dans le désert subsaharien. Et cela constitue aussi, je dirais, quelque chose qui doit être prise en compte parce que ces bandes armées sont sans foi ni loi et ils détruisent tout sur le chemin, notamment au niveau de la forêt. Donc, ma question était la première, de savoir comment est-ce qu'on pourra peut-être mettre des stratégies ou des politiques avec nos gouvernants pour que, même si on combat cette faune-là, comment aussi on peut préserver aussi cette faune qui nous est si chère. La seconde question pour moi, c'est au niveau éducatif. Au niveau éducatif, est-ce qu'il y a des programmes, je dirais, très sérieux à nos jours pour pouvoir vraiment donner le minimum à nos jeunes générations, à nos enfants, pour que demain, ils puissent savoir ce que c'est la priorité de cette faune, ce qui pourrait préserver cette faune-là. Parce que j'ai bien peur qu'au fil des années, que l'éléphant, je viens de la Côte d'Ivoire où l'éléphant c'est l'emblème de notre nation, j'ai bien peur que l'éléphant devienne comme le dragon ou bien comme le dinosaure, c'est-à-dire un mythe pour les générations à venir, parce qu'ils ne verront pas cet animal-là si les choses continuent comme ça. Voici un peu la question et ma contribution pour ce panel-là. Je vous remercie.
Okay. It's like no, I'm not sure. You can't go word by word, but he's happy to be here. He's from Africos. He's the CEO and he works for youth in Africa for sport, focusing sport education. So his question is: there are many conflicts in Africa, and mostly civil war, and that can affect the croissance of the animal all over Africa because of the war, the fire. So what the government can do to help?
When you're putting in elephant protection, and elephants really are the blueprint of successful biodiversity, there needs to be the appropriate security. So, I mean, obviously poaching is one of the biggest problems, and human-elephant conflict is one of the biggest elephant problems. So for poaching, you need the anti-poaching intelligence-led specialist units, and that's just pure training, training and deployment of your forces. And then on the other side, there's the human-elephant conflict side of things. So how are local communities going to live side by side these animals? And then lastly, connectivity is hugely important. So elephants are migratory animals, and they need to be able to travel. They need to be able to go from one place to another. If that connectivity is secure, they will have successful homes to come back to. So they will travel and they will come back, and that is hugely important for that. So I think you can probably go further on this to the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to the first issue on conflict. Yeah, I think you are right. Africa is moving into a phase, the way we view it is that conflict is going to be around resources. And that's why it's important for Africa to conserve. It's going to be around water scarcity, especially if we layer on the impacts of climate change. The resource scarcity that we are going to see on the continent could result in more conflict or triggering more conflicts. So for us, we actually position conservation as a way to manage some of those conflicts. Last month, we had a dialogue with some members from the EU, and their number one concern is migration coming out of Africa. And we are presenting a case to them on how conservation is a window of creating opportunities for young people in terms of employment, but also of providing the resource base that's needed to sustain Africa's population. If you look at Uganda, has received refugees more than probably any other country in the world. And the impact on their natural resource base in Uganda, because of the demand for firewood, water, is massive. So how can we help Uganda to actually conserve their environment and make sure that they are still receiving the same ecosystem services they want to receive? Because now it's an area of tension between the local communities in Uganda and the refugees that came in, because the local communities are saying we have not been allowed to go into our protected areas to access these resources because we understand they are protected for our future generations. but people are coming in and they are exploiting our natural resources. So we can see how that is already an issue, and we need to put that lens of seeing that if we don't conserve these resources in Africa, and they might be a source of triggering conflict, but at the same time, if we manage to conserve, it might actually help us to manage and solve some of the potential conflict that might come out of that.
The role of youth in conservation. I think one of the hardest challenges in conservation in general is the approach of changing attitudes. Changing attitudes is incredibly difficult in any walk of life for any reason. So for me, as an educator, the role of youth is that we have the opportunity to create attitudes before they need to be changed. And I think that because of that, they are one of our youth across the globe is one of our most important resources moving forward in conserving wildlife and habitat around the world.
I think where I would say this, I think is right now this conversation about climate change, conservation, and land planning is a huge part of this. To educate the youth on how everything is interconnected and what we do in one area has very real repercussions in another is hugely important. So what we do by protecting areas of land that are very valuable for conservation will mean that there's substance for food, for water, and you know, in one such level, there's a perfect example of, as I'm sure you've all seen, the National Geographic documentary on the Okavango and the water sources in the highlands of Angola. There was a potential dam to be put in this highland, which would take you know, half of the water source for the Okavango out. This would mean the Okavango would dry up in the next 5 years, which 30 million people survive off of. So you're suddenly talking about a lack of water, a lack of food, you know, crop plantation areas, and possible immigration issues that come from that. So it becomes a human crisis as well as a climate, as well as a conservation crisis. And I think to interlink these things all together is hugely important for education.
I think that interlinkage is important for education and to solving this problem. We can't look at simply wildlife corridors, anti-poaching, banning trophy hunting, any of those things in isolation and deal with it as one symptom. It has to be dealt as a symptom of the full disease, which is the fact that we are facing the loss of up to 1 million species looking at extinction right now. So this has to be a multi-pronged, multifaceted, you know, conversation and partnership among everyone to be able to tackle this and get it done.
Thank you. Edwin.
Yes, so just to add a bit on the education aspect, you are definitely right. For us, it has been one of the most effective tools. In the communities we work with, we sometimes we go into a quid pro quo arrangement. And one of the things they often ask for is schools for their children. That's one of the #1 concerns. And so we have a program called Classroom Africa, which works on building schools and programs that help to provide education for primary school kids. But also when you say youth, we have to realize that we are talking of an age range of probably from 18 to 35. So we should be able to make sure that we are addressing the various groups within that age range. For example, we have youth that are probably in the 30s. These are people who are already set on making decisions and being key influencers on the continent. How can we make sure that as they go into the various sectors they are going into, they are actually make decisions that support conservation? And so those are some of the things that we have to think about. The African youth that we have to bear in mind is not just the small kid. It's also someone like me. I'm 34 years old. I'm able to go into certain platforms and be able to champion a cause for wildlife. So how can we identify youthful African leaders who are in different spaces to to elevate, to use their voice to elevate conservation of wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's give a big round of applause.